Hi, everybody. My name is Raphael Schöne. Welcome to this new season of the CEBRA webinar, Inflation Drivers and Dynamics. I'm one of the co-organizers of this webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association and the Center for Inflation Research at the Cleveland Fed. Dominic Smith is my co-organizer, and without much ado, let me pass on the stage to Damjan Pfajfar from the Center for Inflation Research at the Cleveland Fed, who will be today's moderator. Damjan?
Thank you, Raphael. The topics of today's sessions are supply chain networks and the macroeconomic expectations of firms, and the causal effect of news on inflation expectations. Special thanks to the organizer, Raphael Schöne and Dominic Smith. Let me introduce the format. The webinar is 45 minutes in total. We will have two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each, and at the end, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but they are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, pose their questions during the presentations already and don't have to wait until the end. The moderator, myself, will then select a few of these questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar. The webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel, recorded and made available on the CEBRA website and CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Before we start, the disclaimer. Participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or a CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Let me introduce the speakers today. The first speaker will be Jordan Norris, who is an assistant professor of economics at the New York University, Abu Dhabi, and he will be talking about supply chain networks and macroeconomic expectations of firm. Our second speaker will be Jane Ryngaert, who's an assistant professor of economics at the University of Notre. And she will be talking about the causal effects of news on inflation expectations. Jordan, you have 15 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Yep. Okay, hi everyone. Good evening from Abu Dhabi. This project is joint with Ina Hajdini from the Cleveland Fed, Satan Kumar, AUT, my colleague here at NYU Abu Dhabi, Samreen Malik, and Matthew Pedamonte, the IADB. The usual Fed and IADB disclaimer applies. So this project, Supply Chain Networks and the Macroeconomic Expectations of Firms, in it we ask a very straightforward question. What role does learning between firms play for their macroeconomic expectations? And we provide randomized control trial evidence on this. Specifically, we run a survey of firm managers in New Zealand. And the key aspect of this survey is that we identify not just a firm, but the identity of its main supplier. And this pair of firms is in the survey. And this allows us to identify the spillover effects, right? So if you treat one firm, what is the effect of that treatment, not just on the firm receiving it, but the other firm in its network? Okay, and this contributes to this rapidly growing literature using RCT surveys that's confined to direct effects, the effect of a treatment on the firm itself. We provide evidence on the spillover effects. The treatment we give it is an information treatment. We use GDP. And what's kind of interesting about the findings is that the spillover effects we estimate, their magnitude is comparable to the direct effects, right? So how much the firm receiving the information responds is of similar order to the connected firm, the spillover effect. So this is suggesting that the supply chain network is a really important factor when it comes to firms forming their macroeconomic expectations. We provide evidence on the mechanisms underlying these spillover effects, like what is driving this interaction. And communication seems to be playing a key role. That is, the firms are just talking to one another. And what's kind of interesting about this is that our evidence suggests that communication leads to symmetric propagation, right? Propagation of shocks upstream and downstream seems to be symmetric, whereas propagation via actions, such as prices, tends to be asymmetric, right? If one firm changes its price, that's more important for its customer than it is its supplier. But communication is just going everywhere, okay? So this potentially reconfigures our understanding of shock propagation in networks. In the paper, we then embed communication into a New Keynesian production network model to look at the macroeconomic implications. For the interest of time, I will focus on the experimental results. But one of the findings there is that communication seems to reduce price dispersion because it just propagates this shock more broadly and reduces inflation persistence. Okay, so first I will show you the data and the research design, how we identify these spillover effects, then the main results, the treatment effects, and then evidence on communication, and then I'll conclude. The data, we ran a survey of firm managers in New Zealand in 2024, and as mentioned, we have pairs of firms, a customer firm and its main supplier, right? So this is business to business, and both of these are in the survey. This is the key novelty of what we're doing. We have two waves. In the first wave, we had 1,000 pairs, so 2,000 firms. And in the second wave, only 500 pairs stuck around. It's quite hard to get firms to participate. So this isn't unusual. 50% attrition is quite standard. Okay, so wave 2 was 3 months later. We separated these waves by 3 months to allow firms time to update their actions and for information to diffuse, right? You want to give enough time for these firms to interact with one another. In the first wave, we asked the firms for their expectations of GDP, both their mean and a measure of uncertainty, the lowest and highest. And then 3 months later, we asked them again, right, to measure the effect of the treatment. In the first wave, we asked what their planned actions were for the next 3 months of prices, employment, investment, and wages. And then 3 months later, we asked them what they actually did over the preceding 3 months. In the first wave, we asked for characteristics, both of the firm and the manager. Ideally, at this point, we would also ask about their supply chain characteristics, how much they're buying from one another, how much they're communicating. But we don't want to prime them, because if we start talking about the supplier and then treat them, maybe they tell the supplier just because we spoke about their supplier. So we leave all those questions to the follow-up. And finally, we actually provide the treatment in the first wave. And immediately after, we then ask their expectations again, just to make sure that they're actually believing us, right? And they're not just seeing this as noise, right? To see if they actually respond to the treatment. So the treatment we provide is pretty standard. If you're familiar with this literature, it'd be very similar to what you've seen there. The main thing is what you're seeing in the highlighted ones. So the first treatment is on the mean, and we give the firms the average prediction among professional forecasts about GDP growth, which is 2.3%. Okay, so we tell the firms this. In treatment 2, we give a measure of uncertainty, and here we don't give the level, we just give the range between the lowest and highest, and it's 2.2 percentage points. And then there's a control that gets nothing. The research design, the way this is organized to get these spillover effects is that the treatment is applied at the pair level. Okay, so we have a treated pair and a control pair. Inside the treated pair, the main firm is the one that gets the treatment, and the connected firm, we give nothing. To identify the direct effect, we compare the outcomes of the main firm in the treated pair to the main firm of the control pair. To get the spillover effect, we compare the outcomes of the connected firm in the treated pair to the connected firm of the control pair. Okay, now moving to the results. The way I'm going to show you these main results is all using graphs, and these are all pretty standard ways of presenting it, but to show you, be sure you understand what's going on. On the x-axis, these are the prior GDP expectations. So this is what the firm believed GDP growth was going to be before we told them anything. And on the y-axis, this is their beliefs after we give them the information. Okay, so initially I'm showing you the beliefs at the end of the first wave, right? We asked them twice, if you remember. The gray is the control firms. And what you see, right, each dot is a firm. They all lie along the 45-degree line. And this is what you would expect, because the control firms, we gave no information. So there's no reason why their beliefs would change. So you'd expect it to be the same, i.e. on the 45-degree line. The first treatment group, we gave the forecast of the mean. And what you see is that the distribution rotates clockwise. And why is it rotating clockwise? Well, we gave them the forecast, 2.3%, and you see the distribution converging to this forecast, right? They're updating towards what we told them. That is a clockwise shift is indicative of a treatment effect, right? So what we're seeing is that these firms are responding to the treatment. Also, with the second treatment, the uncertainty treatment, you see a similar movement, even though we gave the range. This is also a common finding in these surveys. So I won't say much about it now, but in the Q&A, we can talk about it. So these results, this is what's known, right? In the literature, a lot of studies on the direct effects. What's novel for us are the spillover effects. So that is when we look at the connected firms. In the baseline waves, we see no effects on the connected firms as we would expect, because there's been no time for information to diffuse yet. We surveyed a pair of firms within about 3 days of each other. So this is just a sanity check telling us there's no contamination, right? The firm didn't update. We wouldn't expect it to. The key results are going to be on the next slide, which is in the follow-up wave, right? 3 months later, how do these firms respond? So drum roll, what do we see? We see that the connected firm does change its beliefs, right? We see this clockwise shift in the distribution. What's kind of interesting is these two graphs basically look identical, right? The treatment effect size is very similar for both the connected and the main. The spillover effect size is very similar to the direct. So that's saying that these interactions are really important when it comes to their macroeconomic expectations. This is just on their expectations, on their beliefs. You may then wonder, does this, translate over to their actions? Do they actually incorporate this into their decisions? This is what I'm showing you in this table for prices, investment, employment, and wages. In the odd numbered columns, we have the direct effects, even spillover effects. So what you see is if you regress these actions on the treatment, you see for the direct effects, a significant effect. This is what we'd expect, very standard finding in the literature. What's novel is that we also find spillover effects on the actions. So not only did these two firms, learn from one another, but they then incorporate that into their decisions and they change what they did over the 3 months. Right? There's some real effect of this interaction. So what's underlying this interaction? Can we help explain, how this works? How are they learning from one another? That is, we want to understand how does the beliefs of the main firm transmit to the beliefs of the connected firm? And there are two broad ways this could work. One could be communication, right? The main firm just talks to the connected firm and tells them about GDP. But also, we know from the previous table, the main firm changed its prices, its investment, and so on. And the connected firm, having observed these changes, might then infer something about the aggregate state, right? Maybe they become more optimistic and think GDP is increasing. This second channel has gained a recent attention in the literature, firms inferring information about aggregate states from prices, for instance. But this first channel of communication seems novel in the context of firms. There's research on this in households and social networks. We want to see if there's any detectable effect here between firms. To provide evidence on this, we provide 3 pieces. The short story of all this is communication seems to be driving it. The first piece of evidence is that we just asked firms. In the follow-up wave, we asked, how many times did you talk with the other firm in your pair about GDP over the past 3 months? And I'm showing you the distribution of responses. In red is the control, in gray and black is the treated. And what you see is that the treated has a clear rightward shift than the control, right? The treated firms are talking more about GDP than the control. You can test for statistical differences in this and it's significant. Okay, so they're telling us they're talking more about GDP. Now, this is self-reported. Maybe you don't believe this for some reason. So we also use the data from the experiment to provide some supplementary evidence. Here, what I'm doing is regressing the beliefs of the connected firm on the beliefs of the main firm and the actions of the main firm, right? And you can instrument these with the treatment, so you don't have to worry about endogeneity. And you want to see which it loads on. And what we see is that the beliefs of the connected loads on the beliefs of the main firm. It doesn't load on the actions. If the connected firm was learning from observing the price, say, you would expect it to load on the price, but it doesn't. Instead, it loads on the beliefs, suggesting the connected is observing the beliefs of the main firm. And how do you observe a belief? Well, presumably you talk about it, you communicate in some way, right? And so this is why we think this provides evidence about communication. Interestingly, if you were to run this regression without the beliefs in there, then the connected firm's beliefs do load on the actions of the main firm, right? So this is a caution to researchers that run these types of regressions where they don't have the beliefs in there. You might incorrectly infer that firms are updating expectations based on actions, when in reality, they might be communicating. We also did this for their uncertainty beliefs rather than the mean, and you see similar effects. Okay, it's all loading on the beliefs, not on the actions. The final piece of evidence is a little more indirect. We looked at the symmetry in the spillover effects, whether the spillover effect is the same if it flows downstream versus upstream. So in the pair, we only treated the main firm, but we randomized whether the main firm was the supplier or the customer. So this allows you to test the spillover effect going upstream versus downstream. And what you see, without going into too much detail about the table, is you see very little, right? You don't see many stars here at all. There isn't much heterogeneity, especially in this first column and in the fourth column with respect to upstreamness. Okay, so it looks like the propagation via communication, in our case, is symmetric. And this is evidence against propagation via actions because this tends to be asymmetric. There's a large literature on this, right? A firm changing its price is much more important for its customer firm than its supplier firm. What's also interesting about this is the symmetry suggests firms are not engaging in strategic behavior, right? You might imagine if a firm gets optimistic news, GDP is going to grow, they tell its customer firm because they might buy more, but they won't tell its supplier firm because they might raise prices. But we find symmetric effects suggesting there is no strategic disclosure, which you may not have expected. Okay, so in the final minute, I conclude. In this project, we provide experimental evidence on the spillover effects in macroeconomic expectations between a firm and its main supplier. We find large spillover effects both on expectations and actions. Okay, and by large, we mean comparable in magnitude to the direct effects. Okay, so it seems like these interactions are quite important when it comes to the formation of macroeconomic expectations. We reveal communication to be a key mechanism that's underlying these effects. And this is distinct to some of the more standard propagation mechanisms, such as via prices, because it flows symmetrically in the supply chain. I didn't talk about the model, but we look at macroeconomic implications there, one thing being inflation persistence. But the final thing I'll mention is that what this suggests for future research, at least, is given that firms seem to communicate, if central bankers say want to anchor expectations, maybe they do not need to try and communicate this information to everyone. They just need to tell a few key central firms in the network, and they will tell everyone else on your behalf. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jordan. We'll now move to our second presenter, Jane. You have 15 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for having me. And today I'm going to be talking about the effect of news on household inflation expectations. So I think, where we want to start in this is we want to say, the news is important for a couple of reasons. Sorry, I'm trying to hide. Okay, so the news media are going to play a large role in transmitting economic news to the general public. And we are kind of interested in that. We also want to think about this because, the media plays this agenda-setting role in, the world. They influence the salience of different public issues, and this potentially has an influence on both households and on the decision of policymakers. So we're going to ask here kind of this broad question that is, what is the effect of the news media on household inflation expectations? And there's a couple ways that you can kind of think about this. So we're going to speak a little bit to both of these, right? We could imagine the effect of coverage as being, when the news talks about inflation more, do people register inflation more, and perhaps their inflation expectations trend up or down or something like this, right? So basically, can the news influence expectations just by talking about it? This kind of doesn't have as much of an information angle as the second notion of how the news might affect inflation expectations, which is when macroeconomic news happens, right? Like, let's say there's information about the level of inflation that suddenly becomes publicly available. Like, how effectively does the media communicate this news to the public? And does this news actually reach household inflation expectations? So we're going to be thinking about both of these. We don't have very much time today, so I'm just showing you some of our data and just a little bit on the way that we're thinking about this problem. But what we have is daily mentions of inflation on cable news and a daily series of inflation expectations. And we're going to use data from 2021 to 2024, the high inflation period, to kind of think about the causal effect of media chatter on inflation expectations during this period where attention to inflation was high. Okay, so this is just a snapshot of our data. On the left here, we have the daily inflation expectation. This is a daily median that is taken from the New York Fed's year ahead series of inflation expectations. So this is typically presented as a monthly survey, but we've shown in some of our prior work that the survey is conducted throughout the month, that you have a decent number of responses on each day, and that the survey composition looks approximately similar throughout the month as well. So what we do here is we take the median expectation on each day. You can see that this is quite noisy, but there is definitely some signal in the noise as well, and we're going to argue that there is signal in these daily data. And then on the right, we have the daily inflation coverage from kind of three major networks in the US. This is Fox, CNN, and MSNBC. So this is from the Stanford TV News Analyzer. This records the number of seconds that a particular word is said. Okay, so if you think about inflation as taking approximately 1 second to say, this tells you the number of times that inflation was said on these three stations on a particular day. So just to highlight some of the challenge of these data and kind of the question that we want to ask, we're looking at the quantity of the news rather than the content. So we're interested in the dynamic response of expectations at high frequencies to the news. Okay, so look at this this kind of local projection equation here, right? We have news on some date T, that's a day. And then we want to think about how this news impacts the inflation expectation at day T plus H. Okay, so this is, our coefficient of interest here is this gamma 1, and we want to think about this over the course of maybe a couple weeks. Now, a couple of concerns that we have here, right, if we're kind of thinking about the relationship between news and expectations, the first one is that changes in coverage might be demand-driven, right? We might see that as inflation expectations go up, people would like to see more news because they want their priors confirmed, or they're just kind of interested in tracking inflation more, and that the networks are responding to this. So that a positive gamma 1 would be kind of picking up something like reverse causality. Now this control vector X is going to help us to control for this. This has 30 days worth of lags for both inflation expectations and news mentions. And we think that the fact that we're using daily data kind of helps us deal with this kind of demand fluctuation argument that, perhaps demand might fluctuate at lower frequencies in a way that's highly correlated with movements in inflation expectations, but at a daily frequency, this isn't as big a concern. But another concern, I think, is that, coverage might rise after both inflationary and disinflationary signals. So it's not even clear what the sign of that gamma 1 should be. It really should, kind of, if we're thinking about households as rationally responding to information, it should move in the direction that the information moves in. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just this local projection itself, which is just saying, let's look at the effective news on date T, on the expectations, for the next 14 days. This is, the response to a kind of 1 standard deviation change in news coverage, and this is a smooth local projection. So you can see that this has a kind of positive but small and, largely insignificant effect on inflation expectations. Okay. What we're going to do next is note that we actually have, more information than just the quantity of news. CPI releases are made at a, pre-announced frequency, right? We see one every month. And we also observe on those days the kind of difference that release about inflation constitutes to, or the difference from the release and kind of the beliefs of professionals before the release was announced. So what this is a series of the kind of difference between in the announced inflation rate and the blue chip forecast. And we're just going to use the signs of these. We're just going to say, let's look at just kind of positive or negative news about inflation, and let's see what we find in terms of how inflation responds to news on days where we have inflationary or disinflationary signals. Okay, and this is just, the analyzer is quite cool, actually. You can, search for a term that you want to see how much the news is talking about that term on a particular day, or how much they talk about it over the time period. But you can also click on some of these stories and see, what was actually on the television at the time that the word was being said. So this is just to show you that these releases do kind of gives consumers some idea about, inflation was higher than we thought it would be, right? This is a big jump, okay? And this is kind of illustrative of what the news might look like on a day where you have a positive surprise, and you see something similar for days with disinflationary surprises. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to think about, is the response different on days where you have inflationary news versus disinflationary news? Okay, so if you have, we set up that same local projection, but now we add this additional coefficient that's interacting news with a dummy for some category, right? And here we're going to think about the category as being a place where, being, one of two categories, did news surprise consumers on the upside, or the professionals on the upside, or did it surprise the professionals on the downside? So was, inflation higher than we thought it would be, or was it lower than we thought it would be? And we want to, so that gamma 1 is just telling you the baseline of effect of news coverage on any given day. And then this, that gamma 1, and then that gamma 1 plus C is going to give you kind of the additional effect of coverage on days where we had this kind of definitively positive or definitively negative news. And what I'm going to show you is the IRF of gamma 1 plus gamma 1 for the relevant category. I think this is quite interesting. What we see is on days with positive surprises, people respond to this by increasing their inflation expectations, right? The effect of a news, this is again a 1 standard deviation change in news. The effect of a 1 standard deviation change in news mentions is that, inflation expectations go up on the days where the information would potentially drive expectations up. Okay, and on days where the information is disinflationary, we see the opposite. What's also kind of interesting is the asymmetry here, that we see that people respond to this kind of bad news more than they respond to the good news. Just a kind of side note about this figure, my husband is not an economist. I showed him this figure and he said, "Isn't this exactly what you would expect to happen?" I said, "Yes, that's what makes it so wonderful, that people are responding to kind of the information the way that we think they might." And I think another thing to kind of keep in mind about this is that, it's illustrating that you really do need to know kind of the content of the news to be able to assess kind of the expectations response of the news, expectations response to the news. Okay, so we had a very short time today, but I think it was very useful to kind of think about what I really wanted to say about this paper. But using high frequency data, we're showing that, news does seem to have some effect on inflation expectations. And this is particularly true when news is inflationary. So, this perhaps reflects, some kind of bad news bias that households might have, that they overreact to bad news and they underreact to good news. But, this is something that I think we should keep in mind as we're thinking about the ways that inflation expectations might respond to information and to news, particularly in the middle of an inflationary episode. So thank you again so much for having me, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Jane. Yeah, we have received a few questions. Maybe we start with questions for Jordan. Jordan, one of the questions that Dominic posed is, do you have any information about how many customers your suppliers have, and does the number of customers influence your results? And sort of related question is whether the size of the customer or the relation, the main firm sort of influences the results. So his thinking was that, if you talk to Walmart and Walmart is telling you that inflation or GDP in this case would be much higher, you will take it more seriously than when a small supplier tells you that that GDP will be higher.
Yes. Yes, we had the exact same thinking. And in that table in the fact 3 about communication, one of those columns was number of connections. I didn't mention it, but we didn't find any heterogeneity there. We looked at a range of stuff that we had. We had market share of the firms to get a sense of their size, and really very little heterogeneity we would find. Though it's also hard to know if we're just underpowered, because we're already, you're having to split the sample. And yeah, so my response is we don't find any evidence of this, but more generally, maybe with a bigger sample you might, but we didn't. Yeah.
Yeah, another question for Jordan is about the dynamics of the communication. So do you think you had a follow-up 3 months after the survey? Do you think that's when does this communication occur? Do you have any sense whether it occurs immediately after or after 3 months? What would happen if you had a follow-up that you waited longer? Would you see still significant effects? So this is one part of the question. And the second part is that whether the geography of the firms matter. And my interpretation of this question is, if they're closer together, does it, geographically, does it matter? Or if they're further apart? Yeah.
Yeah, on the dynamics, we don't know. There are a number of interesting questions that have arisen from this now. I really wish I was in the room for the conversations about what they would have. But the answer is we don't know. I mean, if you look in the literature, some of these studies have given it 6 months, but that's the direct effect. But you still can see some effects 6 months later. We chose 3 months because it looked like that's where most of the action would be. But yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I really don't know about these dynamics because we don't have the data. On the geography and sectors, we did run a specification looking at geography. We have the zip codes. And there we didn't find, so we looked whether 2 pairs were in the same zip code and if there was a spillover effect between the pairs, this type of thing, and we didn't find any effect there. We could do heterogeneity within the pair. Maybe that's more what you're getting at. I haven't tried that. That's something I can try. Yeah, and then the sector one, yeah, I don't know if I ran within the same sector. That's also something we could try. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I actually had a kind of question following up on this this communication, right? So, one thing that you showed was that the control group shows that they really don't communicate with their paired firm in the months following the survey. So, I wonder if this says something about, the communication being prompted by the survey. I could imagine a situation in which, a connected firm and we both know that we're taking a survey. I mentioned like, oh, did they tell you this thing about GDP? That's kind of wild, right? But then this is not what we see when we kind of actually move to production networks, that if I read about GDP in the news, I don't necessarily mention it to my connected firm, and just how you've kind of thought about how that might change your interpretation of your results, or what caution you might add if something like that was going on.
Yeah, it's a fair concern. One thing to say is that the firms don't know that they both participated, right? They could figure it out if they asked, but they have many suppliers, so how likely is it they? So I don't know. I mean, it's possible some of the firms might do that. Regarding the amount they communicate in the control, 30% of the control said they communicated about GDP at least once. So that red graph, it was less, but still 30% are at least once. We also asked about other communication about product and industry and just economy more broadly. And firms are reporting communicating on these things. So they're not communicating already about related things. But you're right. I mean, you have to be careful how you interpret the treatment effect. And that's the same with all RCTs, because it's not just the effect of information, it's also the effect of the survey. And it's hard to disentangle them. So that's true. That's a limitation, but this is true of all RCTs, and you just have to be a bit careful with that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. So Jane, so Raphael was asking, do you think there is even a non-linearity in the facts, which might also be non-linear on the positive or negative sides? So that's first question, maybe. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, that's another thing. So we could look at is you're 100% right that this kind of we see that the positive surprises, there are some extremely large positive surprises, and the negative surprises are smaller. One thing that we do see is the very large surprises seem to generate more news coverage. So you could see the kind of additional effect of that on expectations, like through the news and through that gamma 1 that we've estimated. But we've done a little bit of work on this, that you don't have many of those very big responses. So if you wanted to do it kind of with that category approach that I just showed you, you just don't have much to estimate on. We're thinking about this though, and I think it's quite likely that you have an effect that's non-linear, and I think your intuition is also is exactly right, that you might have that it's not the same for positive and negative surprises.
Yeah, so if I can follow up, so
Yeah.
there was like previous research, right, using the Michigan survey, where you have perceptions of news, because Michigan survey asked for whether you heard any news, and whether that was favorable or unfavorable, and so on. And we see that the individuals or the participants in the survey are much more likely to report that they heard unfavorable news of certain events than favorable news, and unfavorable news exerts a higher and more significant effect on inflation expectations. And I've done some of that work in the past. But the question here would be, do you have any data on the perceptions of news, or you just have on the supply side of the news?
No, all of the data on news is coming from a separate source than the data on expectations. So, and because we're looking at this kind of daily frequency, we are thinking about other kind of dimensions of the survey of consumer expectations that we could look at to kind of get our perceptions changing subtly with the news or something like this. But there's not really anything about news in the survey of consumer expectations the same way that there is in the Michigan survey. So we don't know what they think about the news.
But for example, there are also news that you can gather the frequency of news in the main newspapers to complement the analysis. So there is these data sources where you can check the news from the New York Times, the news from Washington Post, and you can see the frequency of news there as well.
That's right.
There is a question, which news resonates more, or which one is it? And perhaps one option would be to look at that as well. Yeah.
I agree, and I think that we aren't, we're not working for cable news. We're not arguing that the cable news is the most informative source, right? We're kind of, I think of it as, if the news in the newspaper is kind of increasing proportionately with this cable news,
Yeah.
the measure that we have is a reasonably good proxy of news chatter in general.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's possible that there may be substantial differences in the way that, you know, one news source covers versus the other. But, you know, if they're both going up kind of in response to the same things, you know, we're kind of thinking about news more generally, and the cable mentions are really just a proxy.
I do remember a paper, you know, maybe 10 years ago that compared both of them. They had cable news and newspaper news. I don't remember the results, unfortunately, but
Okay.
anyway. So there was another question for you, Jay. Is
Yes.
what models do you think match your findings well? Also, do you think there might be effects of your news measure on other expectations, like investment decisions, wages, or any other outcome variables? Let's put it this way. Yeah.
So I'll answer the second part of that first. We have actually looked at the effect of this news measure on some other outcome variables, including earnings growth. And I think, you know, what we saw was a kind of very slight immediate decline in response to inflationary news, followed by an increase. So they're like reflecting some sort of pessimism in the kind of response of your wage expectation to this news. But it faded very quickly, like after a few days. And then the other one, what kind of model matches the finding as well? You know, we're kind of playing around with actually modeling kind of how like what it is that the salience of the news conveys to the consumer, right? So you could think of like a basic like noisy information model in which the news is signaling to the consumer with the amount of coverage that they have something truly novel and that therefore merits an actual update. So, you know, if you thought about the quantity of news suggesting something like, you know, your common gain should be higher in this period, that might be something that we could think of.
Very good. Any other questions from any
Jordan
other
has his hand up.
participant? Yeah, Jordan, yes.
Good. Yeah, one of the interesting things I found, because this is a high inflationary environment and still finding effects, and various research has shown people are less attentive in these environments, but maybe it makes sense in yours because you have such high frequency data and there are still surprises. And I just wonder if you thought about that. Maybe there's like an angle about it's not that in a high inflationary environment people don't pay attention. It's just you need really good data to see it because you're gonna learn so quickly and you just won't detect it.
I think that's quite likely right. I mean, I think there's a couple different ways that you could look at the fact that, you know, we're looking at this high inflation environment, right? You might say this only kind of matters inside this high inflationary environment. It might mean kind of what you're saying, that, you know, maybe you're only going to detect these changes at extremely high frequencies. And I think that's, you know, much of the research that kind of looks at the effect of news outside of RCTs, like they're constrained by lower frequency analysis, right? Like if you did this on a monthly level, I don't know how much you would see. I think the daily frequency is really critical to being able to say anything in these data. But yeah, I think, you know, the other thing about the high inflation environment is, you know, I think that you could look at this as posing certain limitations, that this is really only relevant about the effect of inflation news for high inflation environments. But I also think I want to say, as you know, a takeaway from our paper, that I also think that this is the time when it's the most important to think about this causal effect, when the inflationary environment is high and these expectations are kind of at risk of moving potentially a lot.
But can you do it in a low inflationary environment? Like, do you have the data? Do you not find
We do, and you don't see much, which I think is kind of refreshing. I mean, the surprises are also smaller in those periods, right? In general, if the inflation environment is low, the professionals get it right more often. So, you know, our excellent forecasters are failing us in the low inflation environment. Can I answer this last question from Dominic, because it's a fun one?
Yeah. So, yeah, please do answer the last one. Do you see any variation across cable stations? So, because I have to repeat it because not everyone sees that. Do you see
Yes.
variation across cable stations in terms of their coverage of inflation, and how much does this contribute to partisan divides in the perceptions of the
Yes.
economy?
So there are definitely variations in cable stations in terms of the coverage, particularly of inflationary surprises. And one of the reasons, aside from the high inflation environment, but we wanted to limit ourselves to a single presidential administration, so that, we had, within a station, the station was kind of behaving consistently in their response to the news. So we definitely see some suggestion that kind of Fox is more preoccupied with inflation, particularly following these positive surprises than the other stations are. And in a little back of the envelope calculation, we find some suggestive evidence that this could contribute to, some part of the partisan difference in expectations that emerged during this period.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think we are at 45, so this will conclude our webinar today. Thank you to all for participating.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you. Bye.